Hello, happy Friday to everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Um, Glad that Dr. Chuck could join us, and we're gonna get started in just a second. Um,
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are Pre-Med CC, a student-led organization established in the fall of 2021. Our goal as an organization was to create an online community for pre-medical students at community colleges and universities with the hope of guiding the next generation of diverse and inclusive physicians.
And while we advertise our organization as being for community college students, our events are open to anyone. We realize that finding guidance and mentorship in a pre-med journey can be especially challenging for first-generation pre-med students, people that lack the financial resources, or just those that do not know people in the medical field.
One of the best parts about our events is that they are virtual, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. We typically have events on Fridays from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. PST, and on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. PST.
If you aren't able to attend the event, all our sessions are uploaded on our YouTube channel. Many of our sessions will end with Q&A with our speakers. Any questions that you have can be put in the Q&A section on Zoom, and our team members will read them and have them answered.
After you have attended our event, you can log on to our website and complete the quiz, which will contain questions pertaining to our session today.
If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be awarded a 2-hour mentorship certificate to show that you attended our session today.
If you want to stay connected with our upcoming events or want to tell your pre-med friends about Pre-Med CC, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Pre-Med CC.
Righty, well, welcome everyone on this beautiful, warm. It's warm where I'm at in San Francisco. Friday. So we're lucky to have Dr. Chuck join us, who's the Director of Advising Services at the Health Profession Student Association, which are the public of Student Doctor Network. He has years of experience both as a in his current role, but also he's been involved in advising, and he was a director of admission at where did it was at Case Western, right?
Well, Case Western Reserve, the dental school, and also Rosalind Franklin University, all the different programs that are there.
Very cool. Well, we're glad that he's able to join us, and yeah, and so the floor is his.
Sure. Hopefully you guys are able to see my slides and I'm coming in loud and clear, I hope, for you all. Let's see. Let me try to set up everything. I'm currently in Montana with my family for celebrating Mother's Day with my sister, who has a child, of course. And so we're all here celebrating together. So sorry if my lighting is not as optimal as I know I would like it to be. But I do want to welcome all of you guys one way or another to this presentation. Please fill out the survey just so we get a good sense of, who are we talking to? And hopefully this will be something that will really help me later on in tweaking my presentation to address you as members of the audience. So thank you all so much for spending your Friday with me and learning a little bit about the topic, which is all about situational judgment tests. As mentioned earlier, the Health Professional Student Association is we're the organizing nonprofit association that basically 25 years ago established the Student Doctor Network set of resources, which most people know us by the forums, but there are a number of other different donor-supported free resources that we have developed over the years. And certainly, 25 years is a long time. So the internet has certainly evolved a lot since then. So many of the people that we have helped as students and applicants before are currently in the health professions field. And we really benefit from their expertise of having gone through this process and having a pretty good idea of what life is like now in the health professions. And so please don't hesitate. I really encourage you guys to come and use the resources and not just the forums. And I'll be talking a little bit more about some of those resources with you briefly in this presentation. So we're talking for this presentation, we're focusing on situational judgment tests. And I think for most every one of you guys, you've probably heard about situational judgment tests most recently. So we'll go over a little bit about why they were created and a bit more about the history, just so that you don't have to really worry or be concerned that this is something completely brand new. And what we really know about how effective situational judgment tests are in normal practice when it comes to employment or when it comes to admissions processes. We're going to go a little bit over some things that you really want to think about when it comes to looking at situational judgment scenarios, and also some things that would influence you in terms of, at least the types of answers that you would be providing, and not necessarily if it's a right answer or a wrong answer, but certainly ways that you can really address the concerns that you might have when you're presented with a situation. And then, normally we'll go over some practice, but since we're doing things online, it's going to be a little bit more limited when it comes to, what type of practice that we do. But I do have some interactive opportunities for all of you that we'll be using in the chat box sometime particularly soon. So again, thank you guys so much for being here. So we, as HPSA, we've been doing a lot of surveying, and among the things that we've been doing recently is we've been looking at the landscape, with especially all the virtual interviews. And certainly before the pandemic, virtual interviews are extremely rare if they were ever given. And so nowadays, this is a lot of different schools are doing virtual interviews or in-person interviews and so forth. So we're actually trying to do some work on looking at what that actually means to the applicant journey, and how are people preparing for the different types of questions that you're going to be getting in the entire process. Certainly interview questions are going to be one of the things, and regardless of the format that you wind up being presented with, a lot of people in our most recent survey, of a handful of people who've gone through the application process, really cite the fact that situational or ethical oriented type questions are frequently asked in many of the interviewing experiences that they have gotten, almost as many types of questions as they recall as personal style questions. So tell me about yourself as a result. You can kind of see from this graph, we have these as a preliminary result from our own article that we just published recently, just detailing some of the preliminary results from our most recent survey, looking at what we call the recorded video interviews, which we won't go into too much detail about it, but it's one of the different formats that many schools have been adopting in medicine, dentistry, and a lot of other different fields. So needless to say, situational and ethical questions are really important as part of the overall landscape of the types of questions you're going to be confronted with as a health professional applicant. Now, there's been a lot of research, quite frankly, about the certain pieces of the application process. And I know this slide is really busy. If you get a chance to review it on the recording, you can kind of see some of the major points that we talk about here. A lot of us in the admissions process are very concerned, if there is a way to be concerned about, of making sure that the information that we get from an application really gives us some reliability when it comes to your preparation to make it to the next step in a health professional field, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, or whatever else have you. And for the most part, this sort of this particular review really summarizes a lot of the evidence that had been compiled about the interviewing process, predominantly for medical and other health professions programs. And for what they've come to a conclusion, at least based on the data, is that these types of situational type questions, you'll have heard of situational judgment tests or multiple mini interviews, that particular style or format of questions seems to provide the greatest validity or reliability when it comes to selecting candidates for the next step for medical school or dental school or a healthcare career. So there's reasons why many of these schools have slowly but surely over the last 10 or so years gone and adopted multiple mini interviews as their preferred interviewing format. And now we're in a process where situational judgment tests are also starting to be much more prolific within the admissions landscape, even though it has been there before. If you notice from the last slide, and I'll bring it forward here to this slide, what's the difference between situational judgment tests and multiple mini interviews? There's really a particular difference is really that when we talk about, quote, situational judgment tests, they are really designed to be a high volume and assist in high volume screening. That's the original intent. And even the goals for, we'll talk about the AAMC preview, a situational judgment test, one of the stated goals is to assist with the screening of applications in a holistic context, by especially with regards to high volume, to be able to help funnel a smaller number of applications from a larger group for screening, as mentioned before. And of course, a lot of these other goals are very important and are certainly emphasized to many of you who are applicants or going to be new members of our upcoming health professions classes themselves. So I just want to make sure that you give yourself a chance to answer the questions, but I also, want to emphasize that this is something that's going to be a natural part of the application process. In fact, situational judgment tests are part of a larger group of tests that you will be confronted with in the rest of your health professional education and training. They're known as objective structured clinical exams, or OSCEs. These OSCEs have been around, I think, for about 50 years. Some variations of them were developed very, very early on in the 70s, as I mentioned, as the gold standard to really help identify individuals when it came to licensure examinations. So from there, multiple mini interviews were therefore created as a variation of an OSCE. And consequently, Casper is one of those online multiple mini interview platforms that were such created. So it's been around. I'll show you some slides about that for a number of years. But needless to say, for those of you who are applying to medical schools, for sure, the US medical schools, you're going to see that there's a number of schools at this time that really would require you to take the Casper exam because they've been using it for a while. There are a number of schools that are using Preview, even though this is 2024 is the second year of full implementation of the Preview exam. But as you can kind of see from the slide, even though there's a smaller number that really require you to take the test, there's a whole bunch of schools that are now using it for research, or they're going to kind of do some comparisons versus other metrics that they'll see later down the road for the students that they wind up admitting. Needless to say, at this time, in about, we can probably predict in a number of years, you're going to see that number of required Preview schools go up. And as there's more validity to the preview exam for how well people do in at least the allopathic and some osteopathic medical schools, you'll see that probably these SJTs are going to be just part of the whole entire application process. I talked about recorded video interviews. We're not going to discuss things like that, but Curatalent, Spark Hire, SparkView are some of the names that you will see very predominantly in many of those recorded video interviews. So how does this impact you as an applicant? Do you have to take one, the other, or both? Well, back in 2023, the first year of full implementation of the Preview exam, we could actually deduce the number of in-state applicants, for example, who had programs that they would likely apply to. One in-state program would require Preview, the other would require Casper. And when you totaled all the numbers up, it turned out that we would estimate about 20%, 1 in 5 of all applicants to some medical school in the United States would likely be taking both exams. Well, what we found out since is within that first year of full implementation, about 20,000 people took the Preview exam alone, which is, again, the smaller number of required schools that required the Preview exam. And of course, there's tens of thousands of people that take the Acuity Insights Casper exam. It's not just med students, it's a whole bunch of different professions, which I'll show you in a second. So needless to say, this is something that everyone has caught wind of and has basically determined, hey, this is something that's very important to me. And so I'm probably going to have to plan to take one, the other, or both of these exams in the very near future. Quite frankly, as I mentioned, Casper is the older of the two of these situational judgment tests that we are familiar with. In Canada, they're essentially part of their entire admissions process to a multitude of various health professions programs, as sort of outlined on this slide. And if you get a chance to see it on the recording, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different programs, or at least program categories that would require Casper. This is not as prolific in the United States, but there's still a number of different health professions aside from medicine that have programs that are requiring Casper for people who are attending their programs or applying to their programs. Furthermore, more recently, we've started to see a number of graduate programs, so residency programs asking applicants to also take the Casper situational judgment test as part of the process to be selected to be part of their residencies. So I kind of warn everybody, you can try to avoid the Casper early, but in all likelihood, if you're looking at some of these other health professional fields, urology, ophthalmology as examples, those types of very selective and competitive residencies, chances are you're probably going to be confronted with some sort of situational judgment test because, quite frankly, you have your OSCEs as well to get, to pass all of those various board exams to receive your license. So this is something that you're just, we all have to embrace. And it's something that is an essential part of your education going forward. I know I'm not going to have a lot of time to go through all the slides. I really encourage you to visit each of the testing sites, which gives you a lot of detail about the types of exams and how they are confronted, how they're organized. Casper, for example, is the situational judgment test that we like to talk to because it's been around. It's over 20 years of development. It is very well known for an open-ended response. So you either speak your answer into the web camera or you type a response in. It just sort of depends on where you are during the test. There's 14 scenarios. The test lasts about an hour and a half. And there's a lot of insight about what types of scenarios that are generally covered in Casper. Again, it's not just medicine, it's a whole variety of different career paths that they cater to, not just in the US, but also other English-speaking programs around the world. So the scenarios are not going to be focused specifically on medical ethics or clinical training in particular. In a lot of cases, you're going to see many other real life situations that you're going to be making decisions on or making comments about one way or another. Scoring is done in a specific way. It's statistical. It's based on the performance of everybody who is taking the same exam with you at the exact same time. And you wind up finding out what your quartile is relative to the entire testing group that takes the exam with you. In contrast, while you get the quartile rank, individual schools get the percentile rank, normalized statistically to a z-score. And if you know your statistics, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, that's easy. You can look it up. But needless to say, there's a way that we can determine how you fall relative to the middle, to the mean of your entire performance group. And that is what is communicated to schools. All of that is all normalized so that people who take it one particular day versus another particular day are not penalized. So that's just sort of in brief how these tests are scored. And I encourage you, we've got articles about it, but certainly go to the website and learn a little bit more about Casper itself and whether the schools you're looking for to apply to are requiring it. The preview exam, on the other hand, it's been around actually for about 10 years of development and validation. It originally was part of the process where they wanted to revise the MCAT back in 2015 and add a situational judgment test. But then it was considered to just make the test much longer and probably was unnecessary. So they decided to spin it off as a separate exam. And so now we're at a point where they're ready that they've completed their development. They're ready to they've done some pilot testing and now they're ready to implement it fully to any school that finds it very useful for their evaluation and holistic review processes. It's a little bit different in that there's many more scenarios and a lot more test items, but instead of it being an open response format, they're using multiple choice. So it winds, and it's basically scaled in a way that's so similar to the MCAT that, it's meant to be designed to be valid for multiple application cycles. So there's some deliberate choices being made in the design of these tests. I also will emphasize that unlike the MCAT, the answer key is actually based on survey responses of the subject matter experts in admissions and student services, clinical medicine, academic affairs, whatever. So you're not able to actually appeal your score in the same way that you could do it for the MCAT. So I just want to make sure that you know that for many students that are taking this exam, the important question is to realize, we're emphasizing professionalism and also expectations of what academic administrators and faculty would want you to do in those types of situations, which are, again, very common and very frequently observed among most of the medical schools that are surveyed that develop this test. Both tests talk about competencies that they assess in their individual tests. And so this is the list of those competencies, and I've color coded them to help me realize, where are their common themes among all of their competencies. And when you do it this way with the preview competencies, the Casper competencies, you find that there's really one that sticks out very prominently, and that's in the Casper assessment, where problem solving is one of the important competencies that is evaluated on their test. And it's not seen as, so much in the preview exam, needless to say. That also is reflective of the design of the tests, and because both tests are very different. And so I want to make sure I explain to you the differences between the tests, even though the competencies that are being evaluated and assessed are predominantly the same. So if you're interested, and again, I apologize for those of you who are in the recording, take out your phones and you can snap this QR code. We have been doing surveys of the situational judgment test experience for the last couple of years to try to draw some insights about how other applicants before you have adjusted to this new environment where situational judgment tests are emerging to become part of your application process, and how are they preparing to be as effective as we possibly can. And I mean, I believe in data being something that will help you figure out what course you should take when it comes to preparing for these exams. So I encourage you, please read those reports that we have on our blog site, as it were, and read about the 2022 survey, which was the first one that we did. Again, at that period of time, it was not fully implemented. We still had most of the testing dates done during the summer. So most of the people who took the exam were taking it at home, and whether it's Casper or Preview. Obviously, for Casper, there were many other fields represented in our field, in our study, but we were interested for sure for the ones that took both Casper and Preview, and there were a handful that did. And what you'll see from the survey here and some of our results here is that we want to emphasize to you that two tests are different from each other. Just because you think you're going to score very high on one test does not necessarily mean you're going to also score very high on the other. And if you do the math very quickly across on this data slide over here, you're going to see among the 27 people that took both preview and survey in this survey, the distribution of scores across all four quartiles for Casper was relatively even. You can see that numerically, but if you averaged everybody's quartile score, then you also can do the sums across the rows, and you see everybody's pretty close to being 7. On the other hand, for preview, you kind of see that there is a remarkable skew towards the fourth quartile set of scores for preview, 6, 7, 8, or 9. And you can see that if you sum all the numbers by row, and you do the average, and you can kind of see that shift, the skew towards the third or fourth quartiles as a result. So I emphasize to you the tests are going to be very different, and the results that we seem to be getting from our respondents are very different from each other from this particular survey. We also know that people do have challenges, and I emphasize, there are things that the test makers are doing to address many of these challenges. And I won't necessarily claim it's due to what we have said are the big problems and they're responding to us, but these are common challenges that everyone has talked about who have been immersed in this area for the last few years. So for Casper, people are just concerned about the typing responses and how much time it takes. And there's a number of people who are worried that, you're actually being assessed on your typing skills instead of your problem solving skills. And that was that basically resulted in the emergence of these audio-visual questions. So now you can answer questions one by one through your webcam, as opposed to having to type 3 answers to 3 questions in. So Casper has modified, again, a subset of their questions towards that direction. For preview, there was a lot and has still maintained to be some concerns about the proctoring. There's live proctoring and connection issues that were problematic for those individuals who were taking preview. So the AAMC, along with the people who developed the preview exam, have this new video on their preview website to help people who are going to be applying to and petitioning to participate in the preview exam to get a sense of what that experience is like. How do you actually prepare your space so that the proctoring, the security checks all run as smoothly as absolutely possible? So take the time to actually look at that and kind of remember and prepare appropriately as you can. Everyone always complains about the lack of practice questions, and so both Casper and Preview have been doing what they can to provide more questions available I think Casper had presented an online unscored practice test. I believe it is timed. The preview team has recently released for this year a second practice test along with an answer key. So now you have 2 practice tests for the preview exam, unlike previously. For us, for SDN, we continue to have a free Casper SJT forum with about 50 or so different scenarios that you can pretty much run through and practice on your own. But there still obviously remains the final question, which is we really don't know, well, we're having to take these exams. How does this affect the admissions decisions that we have at the very end? And so that's the focus of what we did in our more recent survey that we just completed. And there's some things that we found that were really neat highlights, but I'm just going to jump straight to our admissions results. And at least based on the respondents that we had for our last survey, we were unable to determine that there was any consistent true screening out of applicants based on your Casper or preview your SJT performance. And you can kind of see here if you're from an underrepresented or gender nonconforming group or not. It's remarkable how at least our respondents said, for early invitations to interview, like certainly by the fall or late fall of the application cycle, this was what they saw or what we've been seeing from people who self-disclosed their Casper quartile or preview score and their and the likelihood that they got an interview at a school, at a medical school. So the jury is going to still be out in terms of how these scores are being used. They're not being used in ways that I would necessarily expect and people have used in employment when it comes to situational judgment tests, which is, you certainly screen out the bottom 50th percent, 50%. The lower quartiles, you screen them out and you just consider the top ones. We don't see that here. It may change in future years until more schools become much more familiar with how they incorporate this information into their reviews. But I just want to warn you ahead of time that until we start seeing those data or the schools themselves disclose it, it's just going to be an extra exam and they're going to use it for whatever purposes that they do. So we hope that there will be additional transparency sometime later down the line. So in the near future, if you are following SDN, please, I would certainly encourage you, please join us, become a member, so that you can catch wind whenever we have a new survey that is going to be coming up, because we really want your voice. We cannot advocate for you without there being a substantial number or a strong number of very motivated applicants and future students that really that have concerns about the way that the application process is going. And if you don't, we'd love to hear from you about that too. So make sure you get a chance to read our most recent Insights article about the recorded video interview survey, because we're not going to cover that here in this presentation. So let's go for what I really want to talk about is let's think about what are you being tested for on situational judgment tests. And let's go back to how you make decisions. You make decisions every day. You've been making decisions for pretty much most of your life. Some of them have really no bearing on any, it doesn't matter to anybody else in terms of say what to wear or so forth, versus big consequential decisions like what school am I going to attend? What car am I going to drive? It depends on where you want, how much energy and effort you go into making that choice, whether it's an impulsive choice or something that requires a full analysis. That can you wait to buy it until later? Or does it has to be now? Is this the right time to purchase something? And certainly one other thing is if you really don't have enough information, do you get the opportunity to ask somebody for help? So those are just some examples of decision making, and it's nicely tied up to a number of different, I'm pretty sure you probably are familiar with some psychological concepts. One of them is this: most of us like to make decisions based on what we can consider the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So things that will allow us to know that we are satisfied when it comes to our physiological needs, things that tell us that we're in a very safe environment, an environment where we feel like we belong and we're around people who we can trust. And certainly the last is the self-actualization, where it's it affirms who we are and affirms our value and confirms what we are thinking one way or another. So these are the main drivers that for most people, that's how we make decisions. It's to that particular benefit. And it's along those lines that there's a general model of decision making. It's such a simple model that even we teach this to middle schoolers. If you haven't even had it, that's okay. Essentially, what we find is that once you have a decision, you really start to brainstorm your options think about the outcomes and the consequences, and then make your most informed decision. And once you've made your decision and you've seen some outcomes, you sort of reflect on the decision one way or another. So with the Casper exam, because of its open-ended format, you're actually allowed to really be tested on most of the steps of this decision-making process. Whereas for preview, because of its design, you're actually winding up assessing how effective or ineffective certain actions are. So you're in effect reflecting on those consequences and those decisions that are presented to you as being effective to ineffective one way or another. So this is the theory, if I will, to show you that the tests are very similar, but also very different. And so what you're being tested for is different in both of those exams. Let me start with an example for you for how this works. And I would love for you to use the chat box for this particular scenario. I'm giving you a little bit of time to read it, but this is an example scenario. You and your peer are in a really tight schedule to go to a volunteering opportunity. Traffic starts getting slower, but you have a GPS map program that says you can take a faster route. Your companion actually says, wait, that detour takes us through the ghetto and I don't want to get shot. So in the chat box, please type, what would you do? Would you stay or take? Stay the course and go on your route and go towards the accident, or would you take the detour regardless? So I'm going to give you like about 10 seconds. Just type in the webinar chat. Just tell me which, and there's no wrong answer. I want to assure you, or there's no right answer. I also want to assure you. So let me just see if you guys have a chance. Just please post. Oh, you want to post in the Q&A if you have questions. But for the chat, please say if you want to stay the course or take the detour. I just want to see if you guys are out there. And I'm trying to see. Oh, I see. You're all going to go into the Q&A. But yep. Chat is disabled. Oh, chat is actually active. And this is one of my tests. So as you can kind of see, I'm sure every one of you has some sort of opinion on whether you would just keep going or you're going to take the detour anyway, because you have all these conflicting interests. But I want to encourage you to kind of notice some things about this scenario. It's not the most optimized scenario because there's some questions that I think many of you would have. Now, I forced you guys to make a choice. But in reality, many of you may actually realize there's some interesting information that's particularly missing, like who's driving? Would it really make a difference in terms of what the outcome is if you were the driver or if Bree were the driver? So imagine if Bree was the driver and that person is driving and has control of the car and says that detour takes us to the ghetto, I don't want to get shot. Guess what you're going to do? You're going to stay the course. If it winds up that Bree is the passenger and you're the one driving, you obviously have more agency to either take the course or stay the course or take the detour. And depending on what road you're taking, you can kind of figure out for yourself whether there's an alternative route even within the detour itself. But more interestingly is a scenario where both aren't driving. Maybe there's somebody else, you're in a common car or in a bus or a van or something like that, and somebody else is driving. And so the comment to you from Bree may not necessarily affect the actual driving, but the driver may hear you. So I'm not entirely sure. You can kind of see here that there are many ways to really address this scenario, and this really depends on what I will call as context. So when you are looking at scenarios like this, realize who else is in the scene with you. Are you all with equal power or authority, or is there a disparity? Like, so again, who has the wheels on the steering wheel of the car? Can you appeal to somebody if it's appropriate? Those are things that as you look at the scenario, you kind of figure out, well, what am I able to do? What are my limits to action? And how does that inform my ultimate decision on one choice or the other or some other choice that's available? Certainly, there's also things that I know we will certainly bring up, which is the other rules or etiquette that constrain your response. You can't obviously grab the steering wheel from Bree if Bree is the driver. So what are the rules that you need to play and be able to acknowledge? We're certainly understanding of the medical or professional ethics rules that we all need to understand before getting into a health professional field. We also know that there's a lot of emphasis on academic integrity and student code of conduct, especially in academic health center type settings. And those are the things that you want to make sure that when you're there, you have some exposure to that. Finally, especially if you see from some of the competencies, there is some acknowledgement that you probably should know something regarding diversity, cultural competency, a sense of justice and equity, and how is that sort of played out in the way that you make decisions. So these are some of the examples of ways that you probably are being tested in the context of the scenarios that you're going to get. If you guys have any questions, I encourage you guys to use the question and answer session, the question and answer function here in Zoom. But for the scenarios I'm going to present with you, I would love for you to use the chat instead. I'm going to first of all present you some scenarios that I will say I will have quote written in a multi-mini interview Casper-like scenario. These are not actual Casper questions because I wrote them. We don't want to go into non-disclosure agreements or anything else like that. So these are just simulated scenarios that hopefully will give you a sense of, if you got this scenario as something you would be discussing in an online MMI as an example, how would you respond? We're not going to show you the questions that correspond to each scenario, but I'm going to emphasize what I've been pushing to you guys just previously, understanding the context and trying to come up with, as you go along the series of questions that I ask you, just your thinking process. How would you think about the scenario in terms of a response? For this section, you do not need to make any responses into the chat box. You give yourself a chance to think about it, come back to the recording, and on your own, you can pause at any point and you can start writing your answers to just the query questions that I'm going to be giving you. Again, this is not a bona fide MMI or Casper. Okay? So if this is all right with you, this is an example of one such scenario that I could probably have created for you for an MMI. And so if you can read here, for those of you who are not able to see it and want me to read it out for you, your study group is taking a break. You're scrolling through short videos during your break, and one of your peers recognizes a female classmate, initial G, from a few sexually suggestive clips. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of these from your scrolling through videos on your breaks, on your phone or whatever, but I guess that's common. Some videos seem to be recorded on in-campus study rooms and also in various homes. Your peer actually says, hey, is that really our classmate G? And I recognize that video. Wasn't that video taken at Professor X's house? So in this scenario, and again, you don't need to type anything into the chat or into the Q&A box. Have you had experience with something similar to this? And if so, hopefully that informs you with regards to your answer. Look at the other players in this scenario, at least those that are specifically mentioned and maybe those that are implied. Figure out, are you all equal, or is there a power mismatch? Someone has more responsibility or authority to do something. What are the important rules that are in play in this scenario? Can you make some plausible explanations about how this is true and how this really isn't a problem? Think about, if you didn't do anything, what are some of the consequences of not taking action? And then finally, figure out, if you did decide to take action, how are you limited in your responses? What are the consequences of taking actions themselves? So these 6 questions are going to be in every single one of the scenarios that are going to be part of here. So it's really meant for you to be thinking about it. And when you get a chance to review the recording, give yourself a little bit more time to sort of write out your responses there. Again, I don't have any prompt questions for you for these scenarios. So it's just for you to think about it and sort of go through the process of decision making yourself, and that will help you out with your answers. Here's a second one, and I'll give you a chance to kind of read it. So I'm going to give myself about 10 seconds here. So I'm not sure if any of you have observed a similar situation. I promise you, I wrote this scenario a couple of years ago, prior to any of the challenges that have been occurring on campus with regards to the campus protests. We're not asking you to take a side, but we're asking you some thoughts and ideas. And in this scenario, what are some of the questions you might anticipate would be asked of you that follow, I hope, the set of 6 questions for your thinking as you set up what you hope will be your answers to this scenario. Here's the third question. Maybe some of you have had a similar situation or have had friends in a similar situation. And then here's another one. I think maybe many of you might at least maybe recognize a similar situation. This certainly comes up in clinical situations a lot. All right. And so here are just a few sort of those examples. So what many people are wondering is, okay, given what questions you're going to get, what's going to get me a high score or a good score? And I will admit, we don't have the rubric. They don't give us the rubric for Casper. And MMI rubrics can be very different from school to school. But some of the things, if you surveyed the people who rate your Casper responses, they did actually do a survey very recently and summarize the results in a recent webinar from Acuity Insights. And basically, I hope this gives you some insight about what corresponds to very effective responses for the Casper raters. So certainly they want to see the extent to which applicants that they are interacting with or reading their responses understand and interpret the social dilemmas in nuanced or complex ways, justify their approach to a presented situation, propose novel or creative ideas or solutions in response to the situation. So there's a problem-solving piece that's there. Apply critical thinking to situations requiring a professional approach. Demonstrate sound professional and ethical judgment. Consider multiple perspectives very carefully. So again, that's an empathy issue, understanding what are the effects that happen and how would the other person sort of receive your response. Reflexively use examples from your own past experiences and demonstrate key aspects of social intelligence and professionalism. What happens is that a rater would normally give a score from 1 to 9, 9 being the best score for each scenario response. And the sum of all of those, or some statistical manipulation of all those scores, determines how well you performed relative to the rest of your cohort. So that's what the Casper raters are looking for. And we have had a number of different articles over the years that talk about Casper and MMI responses and give you advice on how to respond to those in any of those types of scenarios. So please take the time. It has always been a popular subject when we talk about Casper on the Student Doctor Network. So please make sure you read some of those and incorporate that or consider it as part of your strategy when it comes to formulating your answers. I have my own version, which is the STARE answer structure, which is very similar if you're used to CARS or STARS as a particular construct. I have situation, task, action or alternative, impact, and reflection. So it's just a different way of saying the same thing. Now, this is the part where I do want a little bit more interaction. I'm going to give you some situations, and I'm going to use a variation of preview known as the ranking scheme. So there are some situational judgment tests that provide for you or give you a number of different scenario responses to a scenario, and you are to rank them from most effective to least effective among the group that you are seeing. So you're constrained to the choices that you get, and you basically have to rank them in a certain order. This is something that you're doing very similarly to preview. In these cases, I'm going to give you a scenario, and then afterwards, I'm going to give you 3 possible responses. You're going to get about maybe 5 to 10 seconds to give me 3 numbers in order from most effective response to least effective response. Put the 3 numbers in the chat. So it can be 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, or something else like that. So if you're able to do it, that's fantastic. Again, no one's going to keep your score. No one's going to chide you if you're right or wrong. I just want to see, and I think I want to share with everybody how everyone is responding to the various scenarios. So let's start off with this one. I'm going to give myself about 10 seconds, and then I'm going to show you the choices. And again, what I want you to do is I want you to list each of the responses in order from most effective to least effective response. Okay, so type your numbers. There should be 3 numbers per person in the webinar chat box. So here are your 3 possible responses for this scenario. And I just want to see what's most effective to least effective. All right, go ahead and type in your answers if you're able to see them in the chat. All right, I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. If you're there, I'm going to switch to the next scenario in a few seconds here. And I'm just sort of putting a marker here just to make sure that people know what to do, okay? So I'm going to move over to the second scenario. I'm going to give you about 10 to 15 seconds to sort of read through this. All right, and this is an MMI scenario somebody else made, and I've changed it up a little bit. And here are the three possible outcomes. Please rank them from most effective to least effective. 1, 2, or 3. All right, counting you down in 3, 2, 1. Let's go to the third scenario we have here. Right, and here are your choices here in this case. This is a modified version of a question you'll see on one of the sample preview exams. So in this particular case, you actually do have an opportunity to see an answer key for very similar responses that are provided on their key as well. So I'm just interested in seeing how you respond. All right, moving on to question number 4. There's like, I think I have 6 of these for you guys. So here are your possible outcomes or actions to take. All right, here we go with question number 5. Actually, this is the last one that I have for you guys. And here are the 3 possible ways you would respond to that situation. So I think if this is most everybody here, I'm just going to keep moving on. So this is, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. So if you do have questions, please use the question and answer box now to just make sure that I get a sense of what questions you have about this presentation. In short, we have a number of different resources that I just want to make sure we reintroduce to everyone who's going through the application process again. So certainly, look for one of our more recent articles that we just published earlier in April about what some of those resources really are. In addition to some of the resources you do have available to you, understand that preparing for SJTs is also not just about focusing on the tests. Just like the MCAT, a lot of what you do before you take the MCAT and prepare for the MCAT also comes into play. And so when we surveyed our respondents for how they prepared for SJTs, they found that various life experiences really were helpful in giving them some insights that were going to help them in taking their SJTs and connecting with some of the scenarios that they have there. So, in some ways, this is the test that is not the MCAT. The coursework that many people cited were very helpful to prepare for these situational judgment tests include more the humanities, social psychology type courses, possibly some research or capstone courses that are available too. And there are a number of different free resources that are available. We've mentioned the Student Doctor Network Forum. The test-taking websites have various questions that are freely available and want to help you sort of become more acclimated to the exam. I'm sure that there are many people on social media and influencers that talk about their performances and how they prepared. And of course, there's a lot of review-oriented websites that are out there that help you with a bunch of peers prepare for these types of situational judgment tests. The British version of the MCAT, called the UCAT, also has a situational judgment test attached to it, and there are additional resources in their format that are available in case you want to see some interesting other alternatives to questions and question formats that I presented for you guys here. This is part of a program or a project that I've been doing called Becoming a Student Doctor, and we have opportunities for you to really think about some of those other rules that we mentioned a bit earlier on these situational judgment tests. It's free for those who have fee assistance waivers or graduated from a high school in the U.S. in a medically underserved area. But we also want people who support SDN and HPSA to also take part. So if you don't qualify for free access, we ask and encourage you to be part of us and be part of our donor, be part of the SDN donors or members teams that are out there that have supported the forums and many of the other projects that we do. Finally, while I get the chance, this is the month where we are actually soliciting volunteers who want to be part of our Student Advisory Council to help us further steer our programs and some of our attention to other needs for people who are in health professions programs or aspiring to be part of those. So there's an email that I have here for student consultant with an underscore there at studentdoctor.network. If you're able to and you want to do this for the next upcoming year, we are asking for letters of interest and a brief resume before the 31st of May. And hopefully, you'll be part of the process to help guide us further with more of these surveys or more questions or more ways to let people know that a lot of these opportunities and resources we've had are freely available to you. So I want to make sure that I emphasize to you, in some cases, there's some really hard choices that you make, and there's not always a correct answer, but needless to say, sometimes you just have to make a choice and make a decision as best as you possibly can. And with that, that's the end of the presentation that I have here. So Jubin and everybody else here, thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon or evening with me here. And I'm looking forward to your questions about situational judgment tests.
Alrighty, everyone. So anybody that has a question, fire away in the Q&A and we will ask Dr. Chuck to answer them. And if not, he's in beautiful Montana and we'll let him go. And
well, it snowed here the last couple of days, so having it snow in May is sort of jarring. So,
hey, it's 90 degrees here, so
fair enough.
It's hot. We had actually I work in the ER, and last night we had a bunch of people that came in with dehydration and heat stroke.
Oh dear. Mm-hmm.
So alrighty. My question is, do you think they're ever gonna have a standard, or anybody's gonna do their own test these days?
Well, in terms of what type of test are you thinking of? In terms of
Like
the
the
situational test?
preview, the preview test, the Casper, like are they ever gonna settle for a standard?
I think there's too much money going into both programs that I don't know if there will ever settle for a particular standard. And that's one of the big challenges too. I mean, obviously AAMC includes schools in Canada, and AAMC had, I will admit, first of all, most of the big umbrella organizations, whether it's ADIA, AAMC, ACOM, or whatever else, they've never actually spoken full forward and saying that situational judgment tests should be part of a process. They've actually very much shied away from it, and they've left it to the domain of the individual schools. So again, for the last 10 or so years, so many medical schools themselves have been using Casper for a while, and there have been some published studies. Many of them are case studies by Acuity Insights now that show how effective the Casper exam is for certain reliability metrics in terms of the performances of students in their classes. As I said, AAMC has invested a lot of money in its development of the test over 10 years. Casper's has a lot of money developed in its test. I don't see necessarily there's going to be a meeting of the minds that both tests are going to be that they're going to consolidate. I just don't see that happening. There also are a couple of schools that will basically say, just take as an SJT. We'll use, and I don't know exactly how they're going to analyze people who have Casper scores and or preview scores, one or the other, and sort of put everybody on an even playing field. So there's a lot that is still very mysterious. Right now, we're in a phase where a lot of the schools that you saw, there's like over 30 medical schools that are doing, quote, research on preview. What that actually means, I'm not entirely sure, but at least they're doing whatever they can to see what sort of return on their investment they have for developing the preview exam. Jubin, you probably are familiar that the AAMC had previously been pushing for something similar to an SJT in the standardized video interview for residencies. And even though there was a lot of good research that came out of it, the efforts basically fell flat because there just weren't enough residency directors that really felt that test was very useful. Yet they're still going into using Casper. So I think it's unfortunately I don't see, in my mind, I don't see them going to a singular standard, because AAMC is going to be the person on the block wanting to set the standards, and you just have the Canadian schools that have been just so successful marketing their product to so many different programs and to so many different professions. It's just not gonna. I just don't really see them getting together.
Cool. In preview, I sometimes choose effective, but it's ineffective. Any tip?
Well, so I presume that if you have access to the preview practice tests, all I can say is read very carefully what the explanation is on why an answer choice is effective, but not ineffective. That's the only thing we can tell you about that right now until there is much more information that people can talk about what is that gray area between effective and ineffective. I'm fairly certain somebody out there is very astute enough that they're going to try to crack open the case, as it were, with having an AI bot run through all of those explanations and try to see if there's some patterns. And it hasn't been me, but I'm sure there are certain standards that I'm pretty sure will be articulated, and that is one of the things that I'm going to expect the AAMC team is going to be more specific about what's effective versus ineffective. In terms of getting to an outcome that is preferred, again, by the administrators and the faculty at a medical school.
Very cool. The other one is how to best prepare for these judgment tests.
So preparing for the test, yeah.
Have good judgment.
For these judgment tests, these situational judgment tests. So basically put, as I mentioned before, a lot of your preparation has already occurred. You know how to make decisions. It's the questions of the situations that you need to worry about. And I think, as I presented in a lot of my examples here, it's really much more about identifying the context and identifying the rules. And so understanding the rules and the context are going to be very important. And among the things that you have understanding of is your observations of clinical experiences, your community service experiences, the leadership experiences that you've had. So your preparation actually begins with all the activities that you have taken on for yourself as an independent person, whether it's like late high school or thereafter. So you've already started preparing for the test. What you have to really prepare for is all the technical stuff that is really the main focus of how people really are preparing for the test. They really are familiar with what the layout is, how the questions are set up, some of the user interface type things, the security things, whether you're qualified for fee assistance program so you can get a discount off the registration. So that's all stuff that I would encourage you go to the websites and you sort of read up on all of that. Most people are not taking a ton of time. This is not a 6-month-long project like the MCAT prep can be. Many people are taking maybe no more than a month, maybe no more than 10 total hours getting familiar with the test. And there's no magic bullet necessarily in terms of how well you do one versus the other, but realize that when you're looking at the data, the way that the tests are structured, you have an equal shot of getting into the first, second, third, or fourth quartile in Casper. And on preview, generally what we've seen is that most people tend to cluster a little bit higher into the higher numbers. But again, it's a standardized test. So there's probably in their testing a lot of people who are below the mean or below the median anyway. So all that we can tell you is be familiar with the test. Embrace it as best as you can. Understand that it's meant to be part of an application review. And we will see how the admissions teams and the rest of the organizations talk about why these tests are very important and the utility of them in helping their schools understand your preparation for the next step of your training, med school or whatever else.
Very cool. Anybody else have any other questions?
It's definitely a lot to dissect and digest. So I don't blame you if you want to sort of think about it, come back to it when it's closer. But if you are in the applicant process right now, there is a thread on Student Doctor Network that I curate, which basically I do the best to update everybody of all the professions of which schools seem to want you to take Casper, and what's the breakdown of schools for preview in terms of those that are requiring it, recommending it, or doing research. There's a lot that we hope to hear and discover over the next couple of months as the pre-health advisors start interacting with the people who are involved with both of those tests. But we'll see what happens one way or another. There's going to be a point where, all the answers are going to be the answers. And it's just a question of you just being as prepared as you possibly can. And that's just the situational judgment test part of it. There's also the interview parts that will come a little bit later on too, that we're not talking here, but will be part of your preparation later on if you need to.
Okay. Great. Anybody else has any other questions? All righty. Well, since nobody else has any questions, we will let you go. Thank you again for joining us and answering all of our questions. And we'll post the slides on the page as well for people that want to see. And the video will be posted in a couple of days. So thank you again for making time for us.